The first shock was never the babies themselves, but the silence that wrapped around them like a second skin the moment they were born. In the low cabins of Louisiana plantations, where smoke clung to rafters and the night air carried the weight of damp earth and sweat, midwives began to notice infants whose faces did not fit the stories written for them. Pale skin where darkness was expected, hair lightened by no known inheritance, eyes reflecting a color that did not come from Africa or the long memory of enslaved bloodlines. These were not isolated moments, not strange accidents whispered away by superstition. They appeared again and again, on the same lands, under the same ownership, delivered by the same trembling hands that understood immediately what could not be spoken aloud. The shock was brief because recognition came quickly. Everyone knew what it meant, and that knowledge settled into the room with an unspoken command. This must not be discussed. Plantation life depended on routine, on the careful maintenance of order, and nothing threatened that order more than a living, breathing contradiction. The babies cried like all babies, hungry and small, but their presence unsettled the cabins in ways chains never could. They were proof made flesh, evidence that crossed a line the system pretended did not exist. Overseers saw them first, often summoned by nervous whispers, their boots heavy on cabin floors as they stared too long at tiny faces. Some looked away quickly, others lingered, calculating what this meant for discipline, for appearances, for the fragile fiction of separation between the powerful and the enslaved. Plantation owners were told soon after, sometimes with careful wording, sometimes with none at all. They did not react with outrage or disbelief, because disbelief would have required innocence. Instead, there was a practiced calm, a tightening of the jaw, a decision made without ceremony. The child would be accounted for, but not explained. The mother would be watched, but not questioned. The cabin would return to its routine, and the plantation would continue to function as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. What made these births so dangerous was not their frequency, but their visibility. Slavery thrived on control, and control thrived on silence. These infants threatened both. Their faces challenged the stories owners told themselves and the world, that the plantation was a place of order, hierarchy, and moral authority. The cabins were supposed to produce labor, not questions. Enslaved women understood this immediately. Many had known, long before pregnancy, that their bodies were never truly their own. The birth of a child who looked like this only made the unspoken reality impossible to ignore. Yet they could not speak. To name the truth was to invite punishment that could fall not only on them, but on their children. Sale, separation, violence. These were not abstract fears but daily tools of enforcement. So the mothers learned to lower their eyes, to cradle their babies in silence, to answer questions with obedience and nothing more. Even grief had to be quiet. The midwives, often enslaved themselves, carried this burden too. They had delivered hundreds of children, memorized the rhythms of birth and loss, but these moments stayed with them. They learned to keep their faces still, their hands steady, their voices neutral. Any sign of surprise or judgment could be dangerous. Silence became survival. Outside the cabins, the plantation adjusted itself subtly, like a body protecting a wound. Tasks were reassigned. The mother might be moved closer to the big house or farther away, depending on what reduced risk. Sometimes the baby was kept hidden for as long as possible, swaddled and shielded from daylight, as if darkness itself could erase what light revealed. Other times the child was displayed just enough to establish ownership, to make it clear that despite appearances, this was still property. White neighbors occasionally caught glimpses, enough to notice, not enough to confront. Conversations ended abruptly. Glances were exchanged and quickly withdrawn. Everyone understood the rules of this unspoken agreement. Asking questions threatened more than individuals. It threatened the illusion that kept wealth intact and consciences quiet. Church bells rang on Sundays, sermons spoke of order and obedience, and pews filled with people who had seen these children and chosen to forget them. Plantation records reflected the same careful erasure. Births were noted without detail, fathers left unnamed, descriptions stripped to the bare minimum. A system obsessed with measurement and profit suddenly became vague when truth risked exposure. This was not oversight, it was design. By refusing to document what everyone knew, the plantation preserved its authority and protected the men whose power depended on denial. The babies grew, slowly, inevitably. In their early years, they existed in a fragile bubble of tolerance, protected not by compassion but by calculation. As long as they were small, As long as their presence did not invite too many questions, they were allowed to remain. But time made everything more dangerous. Features sharpened. Skin tones remained light. Hair refused to darken. Each year increased the risk that someone, somewhere, would speak too loudly. Plans were made quietly. Some children were sold early, sent downriver or across state lines, their trail deliberately broken. Others were assigned labor that kept them away from public view. A few were absorbed into the shadows of the big house, serving roles that kept them close, but unacknowledged, existing in a space that was neither family nor freedom. For the mothers, every stage of their child's growth carried new fear. Love was inseparable from dread. To care was to worry constantly about disappearance. To hope was dangerous, yet hope existed anyway, stubborn and painful. Even in silence, even under threat, the bond between mother and child resisted complete erasure. What Louisiana found was never a mystery uncovered by chance. It was a reality long understood and carefully ignored. These babies did not expose a secret. They exposed a lie everyone had agreed to protect. The shock faded quickly because shock requires denial, and denial was no longer possible. What followed instead was a collective decision to look away, to manage the consequences without confronting the cause. In that choice, silence became a weapon as powerful as any chain, ensuring that the truth lived only in whispers, in memories carried by those who had no right to speak them aloud. Plantation owners did not react with surprise because surprise would have read innocence, and innocence had no place in a system built on ownership. When word traveled from the cabins to the big house that another light-skinned child had been born, the response followed a familiar rhythm: quiet acknowledgement, controlled irritation, and swift calculation. These men understood power intimately. They knew where it began and how far it extended, and they knew exactly why these children existed. The appearance of white-passing babies did not shock them, because it was the predictable outcome of a structure that granted unchecked authority over enslaved women's bodies. What unsettled them was not the act itself, but the evidence. A child with pale skin and light eyes threatened to make visible what had always been intended to remain private, forcing into the open a truth the plantation depended on denying. So they responded not with outrage, but with management. Everything on the plantation was managed: labor, punishment, reproduction, even memory. And these children were no different. Owners spoke in low voices, if they spoke at all. Instructions were delivered indirectly, often through overseers who understood without needing explanation. There would be no investigations, no confrontations, no written records that could one day point back to the source. The system did not need to identify the father. It needed to protect him. Law, custom, and racial hierarchy worked together to ensure that enslaved women could not accuse, could not testify, and could not be believed even if they tried. The silence was not passive. It was enforced by the threat of violence and the certainty of consequence. Everyone on the plantation understood that acknowledging the truth would not bring justice, it would bring punishment down on the most vulnerable. Plantation owners relied on this understanding. They knew that fear would do what chains alone could not. In private, some owners justified themselves through language that stripped enslaved women of personhood. They were property, assets, bodies without agency. Desire was reframed as entitlement, abuse as privilege. By the logic of the plantation, nothing had been violated because nothing had been owned by the woman herself. This reasoning allowed men to continue without confronting their own cruelty. But the children disrupted even this twisted logic. A child was permanent. A child grew, changed, attracted attention. A child could not be dismissed as a momentary indulgence. Each white-passing infant was a reminder that domination left marks that could not be fully erased. To maintain control, owners leaned on a network of complicity. Overseers enforced silence among the enslaved, watching closely for signs of resentment or rumor. Doctors, often called to deliver these babies, learned to keep their observations to themselves. Midwives were expected to do their work and nothing more. Even family members of the owners, wives, sisters, sons, were drawn into the silence. Some suspected, some knew, some chose not to ask. Respectability mattered more than truth. To acknowledge what was happening would mean admitting that the plantation household was built on repeated violation, and that was a reckoning most refused to face. Instead, denial was shared like a common language, passed quietly from one generation to the next. The owner's calm response was also rooted in confidence. They believed E-system would protect them, as it always had. Laws favored them, courts favored them, society favored them. Even when rumors spread beyond the plantation gates, they rarely traveled far. White communities understood the unspoken rule: certain truths were not to be pursued. The appearance of these children might inspire gossip, but gossip was easily dismissed when it threatened power. A raised eyebrow, a whispered comment, then silence again. The owners trusted this cycle because they had seen it work before. Scandal required witnesses willing to speak, and slavery ensured that the most direct witnesses were systematically silenced. For the enslaved women, the owner's lack of surprise was its own form of cruelty. It confirmed what many already knew, that their suffering was neither accidental nor regretted. Their pregnancies were not misunderstandings, they were outcomes. The owner's measured responses communicated a chilling message: this had happened before, it would happen again, and nothing about it would change. The women learned to read these reactions as warnings. Any attempt to claim protection or acknowledgement would be met with disbelief at best, punishment at worst. So they endured in quiet terror, knowing that the man responsible for their child's existence was also the one who controlled their fate. Behind closed doors, decisions were made about how to minimize disruption. Sometimes the solution was distance. A mother and child might be sold to another plantation, framed as an economic transaction rather than a strategic erasure. Other times the child was kept close, where appearances could be controlled and curiosity limited. Each choice reflected the owner's assessment of risk. The goal was never the well-being of the child or the mother, it was the preservation of order. Even acts that might appear merciful on the surface, keeping a family together, assigning lighter work, were driven by calculation, not compassion. Everything was weighed against the potential for exposure. The owner's knowledge also shaped how they spoke about these children, when they spoke at all. They avoided direct references, using vague terms or none at all. In their presence, the children were reminders of vulnerability, not morality. A single question from an outsider, a visiting relative, or a curious neighbor could unravel carefully constructed lies. This awareness made owners more invested in secrecy than ever. They became guardians not just of property, but of a narrative that painted them as benevolent patriarchs, rather than perpetrators of violence. The contradiction was uncomfortable, but comfort had never been their priority. Control was. This deliberate silence extended beyond individual plantations into the broader fabric of Louisiana society. Newspapers rarely mentioned such births. Court cases did not exist because accusations could not be formally made. Churches preached obedience and forgiveness without addressing the reality unfolding in the cabins. By refusing to name the abuse, society allowed it to continue. Plantation owners understood this dynamic and exploited it fully. Their confidence was not misplaced. The system was designed to shield them. The children's faces might raise questions, but questions alone were never enough to challenge power. What made this silence so devastating was its longevity. It did not end with the child's infancy, or even with emancipation. The lack of acknowledgement followed these families for generations. Records remained vague. Oral histories were fragmented by fear and loss. Descendants inherited confusion along with their features, sensing a story that had been deliberately obscured. The owner's calm reactions at the moment of birth rippled outward through time, shaping identities and histories long after the men themselves were gone. In the end, plantation owners' lack of surprise was not indifference, it was recognition. They recognized the consequences of their actions and chose to suppress them rather than confront them. They recognized the humanity of the women they abused and denied it anyway. They recognized the danger these children posed to their authority and responded with silence instead of accountability. This choice, repeated across plantations and decades, transformed individual acts of violence into a collective crime hidden in plain sight. The babies were born into a world that already knew why they existed, and that knowledge, unspoken and unchallenged, became one of slavery's most enduring and destructive legacies. These children entered the world carrying a truth no court would ever hear, their bodies marked in ways that exposed a crime everyone pretended did not exist. They were born into cabins meant to hold labor, not contradictions, and from their first breath, they unsettled the fragile mythology of slavery. A baby with blue eyes or pale skin could not be explained away by work schedules or discipline. The child's very appearance disrupted the carefully maintained fiction that enslaved women were separate, untouched, and morally distant from the men who owned them. These infants became living proof of something the system refused to name, that slavery was not sustained by force alone, but by sexual domination so routine it had become invisible to those who benefited from it. No testimony was required. No confession was needed. The evidence lay quietly in the cradle, blinking up at a world that had already decided to deny it. As they grew, the children learned early that their bodies spoke a language forbidden to their mouths. They noticed the looks, too long, too sharp, cast by overseers and neighbors. They felt the tension when strangers approached, the way adults shifted conversations, the sudden commands to stay inside or keep their heads down. They did not need explanations to understand that something about them was dangerous. Their difference was not celebrated or even openly condemned, it was managed. That management shaped their childhoods in subtle, suffocating ways. They were watched more closely than others, corrected more quickly, moved more often. Their presence demanded vigilance because it reminded everyone around them of a boundary crossed repeatedly and without consequence. For the enslaved mothers, the child's face was a daily confrontation with a truth they were forbidden to articulate. Love came tangled with fear, because affection itself could draw attention. A light-skinned child invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited consequences. Mothers learned to protect their children through silence, teaching them early how not to look back, how not to ask questions, how to survive by appearing smaller than they were. This was not just caution, it was a strategy born of necessity. Any hint the child understood their own significance could provoke punishment. The women carried the weight of knowing exactly what their children represented, and knowing that speaking it aloud could destroy them both. The children, meanwhile, occupied a precarious in-between space that offered no safety. They were too visibly connected to white power to be treated as ordinary property, yet too enslaved to receive any protection from it. Their existence threatened the social order because it blurred the lines slavery insisted were absolute. White skin was supposed to signify freedom, authority, legitimacy. Blackness was supposed to justify bondage. These children complicated that logic, revealing it as artificial and cruel. Rather than dismantle the system tightened around them. Rules became stricter, movement became more controlled. The children's lives were shaped not by who they were, but by what they represented. Plantation life adapted around them with practiced efficiency. When questions arose, answers were deflected. When curiosity lingered, distance was created. Some children were sent away under the guise of sale or apprenticeship, their paths deliberately severed from those who might remember their beginnings. Others were kept close, assigned roles that kept them visible, yet voiceless, present but unacknowledged. In each case, the goal was the same: neutralize the threat without admitting its cause. The children were not punished for existing, but their existence was treated as a problem to be solved quietly. White communities surrounding the plantations absorbed these contradictions without challenging them. People saw the children at markets, at church, steps, near the edges of town. They noticed the resemblance no one named. Yet the social cost of speaking was too high. To acknowledge what these children proved would mean confronting not just individual men, but an entire way of life built on exploitation. Silence became a collective agreement, reinforced by habit and fear. Respectability demanded denial. The children learned this lesson as well, absorbing the knowledge that truth could be seen but not spoken, understood but never acknowledged. As the years passed, the children's bodies continued to testify even as records refused to. Census entries reduced them to categories that erased complexity. Plantation ledgers listed them as numbers, assets, labor units. Physical description was minimized or omitted altogether. The system that prided itself on meticulous accounting suddenly became imprecise when precision threatened exposure. This was not an accident of bureaucracy, it was intentional erasure. By refusing to document what was visible, the institution of slavery protected itself from its own reflection. The psychological toll on these children was profound and lasting. They grew up sensing that they were watched for reasons no one would explain. They were reminded constantly of their place without being told why that place felt so unstable. Belonging was conditional and fragile. Identity became a puzzle with missing pieces, a story interrupted at its most important chapter. Some internalized shame without understanding its source. Others felt anger they could not direct. All carried a burden that was never acknowledged, even as it shaped every interaction. For the enslaved community, these children were painful reminders of shared vulnerability. Their presence underscored the reality that no woman was beyond reach, no body fully protected. At the same time, the children were often embraced quietly, understood without words. Among those who shared bondage, there was recognition and empathy that could not exist elsewhere. Still, even this solidarity was constrained by fear. Open acknowledgement could invite retaliation, so care remained subtle, expressed in small acts and quiet gestures. The children's existence also haunted the men responsible, though not in ways that led to accountability. They saw their features reflected back at them in ways that disrupted the distance they relied on. Yet rather than confront guilt, they reinforced denial. Power insulated them from consequence, and insulation breeds indifference. The children became inconvenient reminders rather than calls to conscience. In this way, the system transformed evidence into inconvenience, truth into nuisance. What makes these children so important to history is not that they reveal a hidden anomaly, but that they expose a central truth. Slavery was not merely an economic system, it was a regime of intimate violence normalized through law and custom. These children embodied that reality. They did not need to testify. Their bodies did it for them. Every pale face in a dark cabin, every light-eyed child counted as property, challenged the moral justifications used to sustain bondage. Even after emancipation, the legacy followed them. Freedom did not come with answers, records remained incomplete, stories were fragmented by trauma and loss. Descendants inherited features without explanations, questions without arc. Hives. The children's bodies continued to carry history forward, long after those who caused it were gone. Their existence bridged past and present, reminding future generations that some truths survived precisely because they were never allowed to be spoken. In the end, these children were never mysteries waiting to be solved. They were truths waiting to be acknowledged. Their lives reveal how deeply invested society was in denial, how willing it was to ignore evidence when evidence threatened power. They stand as living proof that history does not only reside in documents and declarations, but in bodies, faces, and lives shaped by silence. Enslaved mothers were forced to live with a cruelty that went far beyond physical labor, because every day they were made to raise children who carried the visible imprint of their own violation. Motherhood under slavery was already an act of courage shaped by fear, but when a child's face mirrored the man who held power over their lives, that courage was tested in ways history rarely records. These women were expected to nurture, protect, and discipline children whose very existence reminded them of nights they did not choose and bodies they could not defend. Love did not disappear, but it became complicated, layered with trauma and survival. Every smile, every first step, every whispered lullaby existed alongside memories that could never be spoken. The plantation demanded productivity, not healing, and there was no space for grief that did not serve labor. These mothers learned quickly that even acknowledging resemblance was dangerous. A careless word, a lingering glance, a comment overheard by the wrong person could invite punishment. The truth lived on their children's faces, but their mouths had to remain sealed. Silence was not just imposed, it was taught, rehearsed, and enforced. Mothers instructed their children how to move through the world invisibly, how not to draw attention, how to answer questions without revealing anything. Childhood lessons were not about dreams or futures, but about caution. Survival depended on understanding what could never be said. Raising a white passing child placed women under constant scrutiny. Overseers watched them more closely, suspicious not of wrongdoing, but of exposure. Any sign of defiance or despair could be interpreted as ingratitude or rebellion. These mothers were expected to perform gratitude for being allowed to keep their children at all. The illusion of benevolence was another layer of control, forcing women to appear thankful for circumstances shaped by abuse. To protest was to risk separation, sale, or violence. So they learned to mask their pain behind obedience, their fear behind routine. The emotional labor demanded of these women was relentless. They had to prepare their children for a world that would never explain itself honestly. They could not offer answers when their children asked why they were treated differently, why people stared, why rules seemed to change around them. Mothers responded with half-truths, warnings, and quiet reassurances that could not fully protect. Each unanswered question was a reminder of powerlessness. The children sensed the tension, absorbing anxiety without understanding its source. In this way, trauma was passed silently from mother to child, woven into daily life. Some mothers struggled with conflicti, emotions that history often simplifies or ignores. Love for their children existed alongside flashes of resentment or grief that brought guilt in its wake. These feelings did not make them weak. They made them human in an inhuman system. Slavery denied women the right to process trauma, to separate violation from motherhood, to seek comfort without fear. The expectation was endurance, not healing. These women endured anyway, because love, however burdened, refused to disappear. Community offered limited solace. Other enslaved women understood without being told. They had seen similar children, shared similar fears, carried similar memories. Support came quietly, through shared labor, whispered warnings, gentle interventions when attention lingered too long. But even this solidarity was constrained. Open acknowledgement risked punishment for everyone involved. Collective silence became another survival strategy, binding women together in shared understanding and shared restraint. The children themselves often became the focal point of conflicting expectations. They were watched for signs of pride or awareness, corrected harshly if they appeared too confident. Mothers were blamed if a child's behavior drew attention, accused of raising them improperly. This pressure added another layer to motherhood, forcing women to police not just their children's actions but their expressions, their curiosity, even their innocence. Childhood became something to manage carefully, not something to nurture freely. As children grew older, the threat intensified. Adolescence brought sharper features, increased visibility, and greater risk. Mothers lived in constant anticipation of loss, knowing that sale or reassignment could come without warning. Each day together felt provisional. Goodbyes were often unspoken, because acknowledging the possibility made the pain unbearable. Women learned to love without assurance, to hope without expectation, to prepare for separation even as they resisted it emotionally. What makes this cruelty particularly devastating is how it erased the women's experiences from official history. Records listed children as property, births as inventory, but never captured the emotional cost borne by mothers. The system that profited from their reproduction refused to recognize the violence that made it possible. These women were denied the language to name what had happened to them, denied the authority to tell their own stories. Their suffering existed outside the archive, preserved only in memory, passed down in fragments. Yet despite everything, these mothers shaped lives marked by resilience. They taught their children how to survive in a world that refused to explain itself. They instilled caution, strength, and adaptability, even as they carried wounds that never healed. Their motherhood was an act of resistance in its own quiet way, insisting on care and connection in a system designed to strip both away. Each act of nurturing challenged the logic that reduced them to bodies and their children to evidence. The psychological toll of raising one's abuser's reflection cannot be overstated. It required women to confront trauma daily without support or acknowledgement, but it also revealed the depth of their humanity. In choosing to love their children despite the circumstances of their conception, these mothers asserted a truth. The system could not erase that their identities were not defined solely by violence inflicted upon them. Their lives were constrained, but their capacity for care endured. This buried story is not only about what was done to these women, but about what was demanded of them afterward. Slavery did not end with the act of violation. It continued through forced motherhood, enforced silence, and unrecognized grief. The children carried visible evidence of injustice, but the mothers carried its invisible weight. To understand these births without acknowledging the women who raised these children is to miss the deepest cruelty of all, the expectation that they endure everything, speak nothing, and still give love as though nothing had been taken from them. Records were altered, births vaguely documented, fathers intentionally unnamed. Plantation books spoke in numbers, not truths. The system that demanded precise accounting of cotton bales suddenly became careless when it came to human origins. This selective amnesia was not accidental, it was policy. History was edited in real time to protect reputations, wealth, and bloodlines. In the plantation economy, every item was counted, every laborer tracked, every asset evaluated. Yet when a child with light eyes and fair hair was born in the slave cabins, the ledger became vague, the birth entry ambiguous, the father's name omitted. It was not that the owners were careless, it was that they understood the danger of documentation. A record could be used against them. It could reveal a truth that the entire system depended on concealing. The plantation's meticulous bookkeeping stopped being meticulous when it came to the bodies of enslaved women. This was a deliberate act of erasure. The slave economy was built on paperwork. Bills of sale, inventories, birth records, and wills all reinforced the idea that human beings were property. These documents were meant to make ownership unquestionable. But the same documents that asserted control also had the potential to expose exploitation. A birth record that named a white father could have been used as evidence of abuse, a scandal that could disrupt social standing and threaten the owner's position in the community. So the records were manipulated. Births were listed with minimal detail. The father was recorded as unknown, not applicable, or simply left blank. Sometimes the child was entered as part of a larger group, as if the specific origin did not matter. This was not ignorance, it was deliberate strategy. Even when the records did include details, they were written in a way that maintained the illusion of innocence. The language used was careful and neutral, designed to avoid implication. The documents were not meant to tell the truth, they were meant to protect the narrative. Plantation owners understood the power of written words. They knew that future generations would rely on these records to reconstruct history. They also knew that those future generations were not meant to know. So they edited, omitted, and altered. The ledger became a weapon against the truth. The practice of altering records also extended to the legal system. Courts and local authorities often refused to hear accusations from enslaved people. Even if a woman attempted to accuse a white man of abuse, her testimony would be dismissed as unreliable. The law was structured to protect property and the people who owned it, not the people who were owned. In this context, records were not just administrative tools, they were shields. The system protected itself by making it impossible for the enslaved to prove what had happened. Without documentation, accusations became impossible to prosecute. The absence of records was itself a form of control. This manipulation of history did not stop with the end of slavery. Even after emancipation, the gaps remained. Families looking for their ancestors found missing names, unclear lineages, and erased stories. The records that could have connected them to their past were incomplete by design. The absence of documentation became a lasting legacy of the plantation's control. It prevented descendants from knowing their origins, from understanding their family's full story, from reclaiming what was taken. The manipulation of records created a historical amnesia that lasted generations. The consequences of this erasure are profound. When a father's name is intentionally left out of the record, it is not just a missing detail, it is a missing identity. It is a deliberate attempt to prevent a child from knowing who they are and where they come from. The child becomes a person without a father, without a lineage, without a connection to the past. This was not accidental, it was part of the system's power. Slavery was designed to break families, to prevent the formation of bonds that could challenge the owner's authority. By removing the father's name, the system ensured that the child's identity remained incomplete and dependent on the owner's narrative. In many cases, the father was not simply unnamed but intenti, only misrepresented. Some records would list the father as another enslaved man, a convenient fiction that shifted suspicion away from the white owner. This allowed the owner to avoid scandal while still maintaining control over the child's life. It also fueled divisions within the enslaved community, creating false narratives that could be used to justify punishment or suspicion. The manipulation of records was not only an act of self-protection for owners, but also a way to undermine the unity of those they enslaved. The careful editing of history also protected bloodlines and inheritance. Plantation owners were often concerned with maintaining their family's reputation and wealth. Acknowledging that a child was the result of sexual abuse could tarnish that reputation. It could also create complications in inheritance, particularly if the child was connected to the family in ways that could not be publicly acknowledged. The records were therefore altered to maintain the appearance of legitimacy. The family name was protected, even as the truth was buried. The act of altering records was also a way to control the narrative of the plantation itself. Plantation owners wanted to be remembered as patriarchs, as men who managed land and labor with order and dignity. They did not want to be remembered as men who used their power to violate women, to father children through coercion, and to treat human beings as property. By editing records, they shaped the story that would be passed down. They created a history that served their interests. This was a form of historical violence that continued long after the physical violence ended. For the enslaved, the manipulation of records was another layer of theft. Their stories were not only stolen, they were erased. The children born with light features were not just denied acknowledgement, they were denied a place in the official story of their own lives. Their existence was recorded in the most minimal way possible, as if their origin did not matter. This was part of the system's strategy to maintain power. If the truth could not be documented, it could not be used as evidence. If it could not be proven, it could be dismissed. The manipulation of records made the truth invisible. This keynote exposes how history itself was shaped by those in power. The plantation did not only exploit bodies, it controlled memory. The records were edited to protect the powerful, to erase the vulnerable, and to ensure that the story of slavery remained incomplete. This was not accidental, it was intentional. The missing names, the vague entries, the absent fathers, these were not gaps in the historical record. They were deliberate omissions, a form of violence that extended beyond the lifetime of the enslaved. The legacy of these omissions continues to affect descendants today, as families search for answers that were intentionally buried. In the end, the manipulation of records is a reminder that history is not simply a collection of facts. It is shaped by power, by who writes it, and by who is allowed to be remembered. The white passing children in the cabins were not only victims of abuse, they were victims of erasure. Their existence was recorded in the most minimal way possible, as if their truth was too dangerous to preserve. The selective amnesia of the plantation did not just protect reputations, it destroyed identities. It ensured that the truth would remain buried, hidden beneath layers of edited documents and silent histories. The surrounding white communities were not unaware. They were not innocent bystanders who stumbled upon a shocking truth and were suddenly forced to confront it. They lived beside the plantations, shopped in the same markets, attended the same churches, and walked past the same cabins. They saw the children with light skin, they heard the whispers, and they understood the implication. The difference between them and the enslaved was not knowledge, it was the willingness to act. The white community's response was shaped by the same forces that upheld slavery itself: fear, pride, and the need to protect a social order built on racial hierarchy. A white passing child was a visible contradiction, and contradictions were dangerous in a society that depended on clear categories to justify itself. Rumors spread like wildfire, but they never reached the point of confrontation. The community understood the unspoken rule: questions were not to be asked, and truths were not to be spoken. People exchanged glances that lasted too long, and conversations ended abruptly when the topic approached too close. The children became a kind of open secret, a story everyone knew but no one was allowed to tell. The community's silence was not passive. It was a deliberate choice. They chose to protect the status quo rather than confront the reality of what was happening in their midst. This silence was enforced by the social consequences of speaking out. To accuse a plantation owner, to name the truth, was to risk being ostracized. Reputation mattered, and reputation was tied to power. White communities were small, interconnected, and deeply invested in maintaining the appearance of respectability. A scandal could ruin a family, damage business relationships, and threaten the social structure that kept them in control. In this environment, silence was a form of self-preservation. People chose to look away because looking could have consequences. Churches played a central role in reinforcing this silence. They were not only places of worship, but also social institutions that shaped moral behavior. Ministers preached obedience, order, and the divine right of social hierarchy. They spoke of sin and redemption, but rarely addressed the sin of slavery itself. The church's message was clear: maintain your place, accept your role, and do not challenge the established order. This ideology made it easier for white communities to ignore the truth. The church offered moral cover, suggesting that those who questioned the system were the ones who were wrong. Courts and law enforcement also supported the community's silence. The legal system was designed to protect property, not people. Enslaved women had no legal standing to accuse white men, and even if they did, the community would not support their claims. Judges, sheriffs, and lawyers were all part of the same social network. They shared the same interests, the same fears, and the same desire to keep the system intact. The law became another tool of silence, ensuring that the truth could not be pursued through official channels. Even within the white community, there were those who felt discomfort. Some may have privately recognized the cruelty, the injustice, and the abuse. But discomfort did not translate into action. Many chose to rationalize what they saw, telling themselves that the children were natural, that the owners were good men, that the system was necessary. These rationalizations were not honest. They were psychological defenses, ways to avoid confronting the reality that their society was built on exploitation. By turning away, they preserved their own sense of morality. The truth was too disruptive to their identity, so they avoided it. The presence of white passing children also exposed the fragility of racial categories. In a society where race determined everything, A child who did not fit neatly into those categories threatened the entire structure. White communities feared the implications of acknowledging these children because it would mean admitting that race was not a clear line, but a social construct used to justify control. The children revealed that the boundary between white and black was porous, and that reality was too dangerous to accept. So the community chose denial. They reinforced the boundaries through silence, ensuring that the children remained trapped within the system that created them. This silence also had practical consequences for the children themselves. They were constantly monitored, not only by their owners, but by the entire community. People watched their movements, their interactions, their behavior. They were judged, scrutinized, and often treated with suspicion. The children were aware of this attention, and it shaped their lives. They learned to navigate a world where their existence was both visible and forbidden. They understood that they could not trust the people around them, because those people were invested in maintaining the lie. In some cases, the community's silence was broken by the worst kind of action, exploitation. Some white men saw the children as opportunities, not threats. They recognized the power of their appearance and used it to manipulate. These children could be used to gain access to white spaces, to perform tasks that other enslaved people could not, or to be passed off as white for certain purposes. This exploitation added another layer of complexity to their lives. They were not only victims of the system, but also tools within it, used to reinforce the very hierarchy that oppressed them. The community's silence also shaped the way history was recorded. Newspapers did not report on these children in a way that exposed the truth. If they were mentioned at all, the stories were framed in ways that reinforced stereotypes or minimized the abuse. The narrative was controlled by those in power. The voices of the enslaved were not considered credible. Their suffering was not considered newsworthy unless it could be used to support a narrative of rebellion or savagery. In this way, the community's denial became part of a national pattern. The story of these children was shaped by those who benefited from the system, and the truth was buried. This keynote exposes the collective responsibility of the community. It shows that the abuse was not only perpetrated by individual owners, but supported by an entire social network that chose silence over justice. The community protected itself by protecting the lie, and in doing so, it became an active participant in the abuse. The children were not just the victims of their owners, they were victims of a society that refused to acknowledge them. Their existence challenged the community's sense of morality, and the community responded by choosing comfort over truth. The consequences of this complicity are still felt today. The legacy of silence has shaped how history is remembered. The voices of the enslaved were marginalized, and the truth was buried. Descendants of the enslaved continue to search for answers, to piece together family histories that were intentionally erased. The community's denial did not just protect the powerful, it stole the ability of future generations to know their own past. This is the buried story behind the pattern. The story of a society that watched and chose to look away. It is a reminder that history is shaped not only by the actions of the powerful, but by the choices of everyone who benefits from their power. Silence, in this case, was not innocence. It was complicity. Even after the chains were broken and the plantation gates were opened, the legacy of those children did not disappear. The story did not end with emancipation. In many ways, it only changed its form. The light-skinned children, born in cabins and raised under constant scrutiny, did not simply vanish. Their bodies carried the evidence forward into a world that had promised freedom but still refused to fully acknowledge their existence. Blue eyes and blonde hair became part of the family legacy, passed down through generations like a secret inherited along with the pain. The physical traits remained, even when the stories did not, and the absence of those stories created a new kind of suffering, a loss of identity, a missing lineage, and a history that felt incomplete. For descendants, the question of identity became complicated. In a society that had used race to determine worth, opportunities, and belonging, having light features could be both a blessing and a curse. In some cases, lighter skin offered access to opportunities that were denied to darker-skinned relatives. It could provide a form of protection, a chance to pass as white in certain circumstances, to avoid the worst of racial violence. But this possibility came with its own cost. Passing required denial, secrecy, and constant fear of discovery. It meant living a life built on the erasure of one's own history and the abandonment of one's community. For many, the choice was not freedom but betrayal, and the emotional toll was immense. Even when descendants did not pass as white, their features still shaped how they were treated within their own communities. Colorism, a painful legacy of slavery, became a source of division. Lighter-skinned individuals could be perceived as privileged or favored, whether or not they actually benefited from it. Darker-skinned relatives might resent the difference, not because of the traits themselves, but because of the way society used those traits to distribute opportunity and status. Families struggled with these tensions, often without understanding their origin. The legacy of slavery created a hierarchy within the oppressed group, and the children with light features became symbols of that hierarchy. This internal division was another way the system continued to control lives long after it was officially abolished. The lack of documentation made it difficult for descendants to trace their ancestry. Without records, family histories were fragmented. Stories were passed down in fragments, in whispers, in half-told tales. Many descendants knew there was something unusual in their family history, but they could not piece it together. The absence of names, the missing connections, the gaps in lineage created a sense of disorientation. People felt like they were living in the shadow of a past they could not fully understand. The truth was present in their faces, but the story behind it was hidden. The search for answers became a journey into a history that had been deliberately buried. Descendants began to seek out records, oral histories, and even DNA testing in hopes of finding clarity. For some, DNA provided confirmation, a way to connect the dots that had been missing for generations. It offered proof that the stories were real, that the features were not accidents, but evidence of a past that had been suppressed. But the answers did not always bring peace. They often brought new questions. Knowing that a white ancestor existed did not make the trauma disappear. It did not restore the names that were lost or the families that were broken. It only made the truth undeniable. In some cases, descendants discovered relatives they never knew existed. Families that had been separated by sale or migration were reunited through DNA and storytelling. These reunions were powerful, but they were also bittersweet. The fact that it took so long to reconnect, and that so much was lost in the process, was a reminder of the system's cruelty. The damage was not only physical, it was emotional and general. Irrational. The children born with light features were not just victims of abuse, they were symbols of the way slavery tore families apart. Their descendants carried that trauma forward, even when they were far removed from the original events. The legacy of these children also shaped how they were remembered in history. Because their existence challenged the narrative of slavery, their stories were often excluded from official accounts. Historians focused on broader themes and avoided the uncomfortable details of sexual violence and exploitation. The light-skinned children became a kind of historical blind spot, a truth that was too difficult to include in the story of a nation that wanted to see itself as righteous. This exclusion was not accidental. It was part of the same system of denial that had protected plantation owners for generations. The history books continue to omit what the plantation records had erased. The descendants struggle to reclaim their history as part of a larger fight for recognition and justice. It is a reminder that slavery did not end with emancipation. The legacy of the system continues to shape identities, families, and communities. The physical traits that were once evidence of abuse are now evidence of survival. The descendants carry a story that was never meant to be told, and their search for truth is an act of resistance. By reclaiming their history, they challenge the silence that protected the powerful for so long. This keynote highlights the long-term consequences of denial. The plantation owners may have believed that by hiding the truth, they could protect their reputations, but the truth persisted in the bodies of their descendants. It continued to shape lives, even when it was not acknowledged. The legacy of these children is a reminder that history cannot be erased simply by refusing to document it. The past lives on in the present, in the faces and lives of those who inherited it. The story of the white passing children is not just a story of exploitation, it is a story of inheritance. It is a story of how power shapes identity, and how silence becomes a form of violence. The descendants who carry these traits are living proof that the past is not gone. It is alive, and it continues to influence the world. Their lives are a testament to the endurance of truth, even when it is buried. And their search for recognition is a reminder that history belongs to everyone, not just those who wrote it. In the end, the legacy of these children is a haunting reminder that the system of slavery was not only about labor, it was about control, domination, and the violation of bodies. It was about the deliberate destruction of families and the erasure of truth. And even when the physical chains were removed, the psychological and historical chains remained. The children's legacy is a story of survival, pain, and the ongoing struggle to reclaim what was stolen. The story is not about mystery, it is about denial. Louisiana did not discover white passing babies by accident. They were not a sudden surprise, a shocking anomaly, or a rare occurrence that left everyone stunned. These children were the predictable outcome of a system that allowed one class of people to dominate another with complete impunity. What was shocking was not the existence of these babies, but the way the world continued to pretend the truth did not matter. The real story is not who the fathers were, but how long everyone chose to pretend they did not exist. The children were born, their faces made the truth visible, and the plantation system responded the only way it knew how, with denial. Denial is not just a refusal to acknowledge reality, it is a strategy, a tool used to protect power. In the context of slavery, denial functioned as a kind of social glue. It held the system together by preventing the truth from disrupting it. The moment a white passing child was born, the plantation's entire structure was threatened. The child's existence implied a relationship that slavery did not allow. It implied sexual violence, coercion, and abuse, things that were difficult to reconcile with the image of the benevolent owner. The system needed to maintain the myth that slavery was a necessary institution, justified by racial hierarchy and moral righteousness. A child with light features exposed the lie. Denial was the system's defense. The denial was comprehensive. It was not limited to the plantation owner or the overseer. It extended into the entire society that benefited from slavery. The legal system reinforced it by refusing to recognize enslaved women as credible witnesses. The church reinforced it by preaching obedience and accepting the social order as divine. The community reinforced it by turning away, by refusing to ask questions, by protecting the reputation of those in power. Denial was not an individual act. It was a collective decision, repeated over and over until it became normal. Everyone knew what was happening, but they chose to act as though they did not. This collective denial was maintained through social pressure. People who questioned the system were labeled as troublemakers, radicals, or outsiders. They were punished socially, economically, and sometimes physically. The message was clear: the truth was not worth the cost. So people learned to keep quiet. Silence became the most reliable form of compliance. It was a way to avoid conflict, to protect one's own position, and to maintain the illusion of innocence. In this environment, denial became a survival tactic, even for those who were uncomfortable with the reality. The system relied on this willingness to look away. The plantation owners also used denial as a form of control over the enslaved. By refusing to acknowledge the truth, they denied the women the ability to name their experiences. They denied them the ability to hold their abusers accountable. They denied them the ability to protect their children. This denial was another layer of violence. It turned the women's bodies into evidence that could not be used in court, testimony that could not be heard. It made their suffering invisible. The system not only exploited them, it erased them. The children born with light features were forced to live in a world shaped by this denial. They were constantly reminded that their existence was a problem. They were treated as both evidence and threat. Their lives were controlled in ways that were not openly acknowledged. They were watched, managed, and often moved to prevent questions. They were denied the chance to be seen as children rather than symbols. The denial shaped their identities. It forced them into roles they did not choose. Their lives were defined by the fact that the world refused to admit what they represented. Even after emancipation, denial continued. The nation that had built its wealth on slavery was not ready to confront the truth. The story of white passing children did not fit the narrative of a country that wanted to see itself as morally righteous. It was easier to pretend that slavery was a distant, necessary evil, rather than a system built on daily abuse and exploitation. The denial persisted in textbooks, in public discourse, and in the way history was taught. The truth was buried in the same way it had been buried in the plantation records. The legacy of denial continued to shape how the past was remembered. This denial also affected how descendants understood their own histories. Families inherited the physical evidence: light eyes, pale skin, European features. But the stories behind those traits were missing. The lack of acknowledgement made it difficult for descendants to connect with their past. They were left with fragments, rumors, and incomplete narratives. The truth was present in their bodies, but absent from their histories. This absence created a sense of disconnection, a feeling of living with a missing piece of identity. The denial extended across generations, shaping lives long after the original events. The denial was not just about protecting reputations, it was about protecting the system. Slavery was an economic engine, and acknowledging the truth would have challenged the moral justification that allowed it to exist. The system needed to be seen as legitimate. Denial was part of the process of legitimization. By refusing to acknowledge the abuse, the society could continue to function without confronting its own complicity. Denial was a way to avoid accountability. It allowed the nation to move forward without fully addressing the harm it had caused. But denial cannot erase the truth forever. The evidence remained in the children, in their descendants, in the physical traits that continued to appear across generations. The truth persisted in the stories passed down quietly, in the whispered memories of those who knew but could not speak. The truth persisted in the way families searched for answers, in the way they sought out records, in the way they used DNA to uncover what had been hidden. The truth refused to stay buried, even when the society that created it insisted on denial. This keynote reveals the deeper tragedy of the story. It is not the existence of white passing children that is shocking, but the length of time the truth was denied. The children were not anomalies. They were the natural outcome of a system that allowed abuse without consequence. The real horror is how long everyone chose to pretend the truth did not matter. The denial was a form of collective violence that extended beyond the individuals involved. It shaped a society's memory, erased identities, and protected power. In the end, the story is not about mystery. It is about responsibility. It is about the choices made by those who could have spoken and chose silence instead. It is about the way a society can protect itself by refusing to acknowledge its own wrongdoing. The white passing children were not a secret waiting to be discovered. They were a truth that was intentionally buried. And the real question is not who the fathers were, but why it took so long for anyone to admit what was already visible.